Well, thank you all for coming inside on a beautiful day. It was a close question for me, but you're all here, so. I guess I want to talk about why California, which generates 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, is spending a huge amount of time and your money on taking a whole series of very aggressive actions, in some ways some of the most aggressive actions anywhere in the world, to try to deal with climate change and to reduce emissions, and why we think it's important, what we're doing, and whether we have any chance of being effective. And on this particular subject, talking to people who are primarily younger than I am, I feel a deep sense of obligation to you to do as much as possible. It's our generation and those before us that are leaving you a world that is not as in good a shape as the one that we received, and that's kind of a violation of multiple rules. But that's not the only reason that California is trying to do more. We're the world's 8th largest economy. If we were a country, there are 194 countries that will gather at the end of November in Paris to try to negotiate a deal around what we do after 2020 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and climate. California will not be one of them. California does not have a direct voice in that process. And yet, we can have a substantial amount of influence. As I say, we certainly have the most aggressive set of actions on climate anywhere in the US. And meanwhile, our economy is growing faster than the United States as a whole. Reductions, obviously, in greenhouse gas emissions are important, but as 1% of the total, they're not the most important thing. We are driving technology. We are succeeding, and that is perhaps the most important piece. So we have a dual strategy in California of action on our own, and we are also, there we go. We are also working with partners around the world, and if I have time, I will talk a fair amount of what we're doing internationally as well as what we're doing here in California, but I want to spend a fair amount of time on what's happening in California. So in the 2020 timeframe, we have goals that are written into statute, AB 32, you may all be familiar with. We are to reduce our emissions by 2020 to 1990 levels. That's about 430 million tons of GHG CO2 equivalent per year. And our 2030 goals are to reduce that by another 40%. So between now and the end of this decade, we have to get to about 430 million tons, and by the end of 2030, we are intending on getting to 260 million tons of emissions. That is a radical, drastic, substantial change that will affect the lives of everybody here. That's, and by 2050, 80% reduction. So a further, from 40% reduction in 2030 to a full 80% reduction in 2050. That is a rethinking of how our economy works, a decarbonization, if you will, of the entire economy. You can think about in your own personal lives what that would mean to you. There are basically 5 pillars of how we believe we are going to get there. I'll run through them and then back up and talk a little bit more in detail. So the first is by 2030, 50% of energy will come from renewable sources. We will double energy efficiency from where it is now in buildings by 2030. We will cut in half our use of oil in the transportation sector in the same time frame. We will have a very substantial reduction in short-lived climate pollutants. And fifth, for working and natural lands in California, we will turn them from right now a producer overall of emissions to a significant sink for climate emissions in California. So a rather ambitious set of goals. Let me start with pillar number one, 50% renewables. So in California, we have a very particular definition of renewables for this purpose that does not include nuclear and it does not include hydro. California probably has about 4,000 or 5,000 megawatts, which is a little less than 10%, maybe 8% of the generation in California are from those two sources, which, by the way, are pretty much zero GHG. So when California says we're going to get to 50% renewables by 2030, we're actually going to be significantly beyond that. That is more renewables than pretty much anywhere else, particularly for a large economy. 10 years ago, pundits and utilities, which are not necessarily the same, said they could not reach 20%. The legislature actually got enough votes and acted and required a 20% RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard. And soon after Governor Brown took office, he signed a bill requiring 33% by 2020. Well, right now we are at about 28 to 30%. The third largest utility in California, SDG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, has been over 33% for a full year. The others are catching up. I estimate we'll be at 33% perhaps by the end of next year and certainly before 2020. So in some ways, I don't know if this is an irony, but it is in fact the case that of all the goals that I just talked about, the 50% goal by 2030 may be the easiest. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it may be among the easiest to get there. I think we see how to do it. We believe from a grid perspective overall in terms of the state and how the grid operates that we know the grid can handle it. That's going to require some changes. The most significant of which I suspect a lot of people at Stanford are thinking about a fair amount, which is how do we store energy in an efficient way, in a cost-effective way. It could be batteries, it could be pumped storage. There are many possibilities, and there are a lot of people working on it. It's sort of the holy grail of energy and climate both, and somebody or some whole group of people are going to make a lot of money when it gets solved. And hopefully they will be in California. California, by the way, has the only requirement for procurement of energy storage anywhere in the world. We have a law that actually Governor Brown sponsored when he was Attorney General Brown that requires 1,350 megawatts by 2025. That's a very small number of megawatts, but it has driven the market in some really interesting ways. And I think storage is maturing right now. I read an interview with Elon Musk who says that he will have a car that has a 600-mile range in 3 years. Can we wait on the questions until the very end?
It has to do with what you
But you know what? Just give me the chance to.
But energy storage is not megawatts.
I'm sorry, but we'll get to it.
Till the end.
I appreciate it. You know, there's a lot of people here. I don't mean to be rude, but I think it would be better to wait. So, at any rate, we're working on all kinds of issues related to this. Microgrids we have to upgrade our grid system overall. Microgrids are among them. Demand response. There are all kinds of things that we need to improve and do better. We need to create a system that integrates with new technology, and I think we're on the way to do that. Another thing I just heard, Siemens is now shipping wind turbines that generate a single wind turbine 7 megawatts. That is kind of an amazing single entity. Okay, so the second issue, or the second pillar, is to increase energy efficiency in buildings. We've, in California, have not done as well as we had hoped or as we should have to this point on this particular subject. There are about 14 million buildings in California. Their energy efficiency is stuck in some decades in the past. New buildings that we build are extremely efficient. They're subject to something called Title 24 that has some of the best energy efficiency requirements anywhere in the world. But the real challenge is to get at efficiency for buildings that already exist. They use a very significant percentage of power in California. SB 802 was just passed. The governor, I anticipate, will sign SB 802, which requires benchmarking for buildings over 50,000 square feet. This is going to give a very public and transparent view of what the energy usage is for large buildings, which end up, not surprisingly, being a very large percentage of energy usage among buildings in California. So I think it's gonna usher in a new era, and I think because it's such an important aspect, energy efficiency, and because we continue to believe that ultimately energy efficiency saves money, that we will see more action legislatively and administratively to increase efforts around building efficiency. And I think that what we know from new construction is that it is possible to really increase energy and get to near net zero. So, and I should mention that there are billions of dollars being spent by the energy utilities currently, and I think the PUC is looking very carefully at how to improve the outcomes of those billions of dollars. And that will be high on the agenda in the next couple of years. So one of the most controversial of the pillars, if perhaps the most, is that we need to cut our oil usage in the transportation sector. As the governor put it in his inauguration very carefully, he said up to 50%. It is, in shorthand, we tend to talk about it as 50% reduction. It was part of the legislative session this year because oil companies spent a lot of money attacking part of SB 350, which would have codified this idea that we're to reduce oil usage by 50% by 2030. So as a result of that political process, SB 350 was amended and that provision was taken out. But it turns out that, not surprisingly, if you do the numbers, the 50% reduction is in some ways going to happen if we're going to make our 40% reduction in GHG emissions. You can do it by looking at the demand side. We have to increase the number of electric vehicles and reduce the number of combustion engines that are on the road. If we do that to the tune of some millions of vehicles, zero-emission vehicles by 2030, on the natural, we will reduce our oil usage by a very substantial percentage, approaching 50%. So whether it's codified or not, if we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in the way that we're intending, this is going to happen, whether it's, as I say, if it's in law or if it isn't. So I'll get to some of the land use pieces of this in a second when I talk about working lands. The governor is very fond of noting that Californians drive 330 billion vehicle miles a year. That is a few thousand trips to the sun. So we have some work to do on land use, but I'll get to that in a second. You might, one of the things that is going to occur, actually even in my lifetime, but it's certainly in all of yours, self-driving vehicles. That could increase vehicle miles traveled, and it could reduce them. It depends on what policies we want to pursue, and it depends on how we want to think about, should we have a self-driving vehicle for every child in America, or perhaps no self-driving vehicles for any child in America. Those are different views of the world, but hopefully all of them will be zero-emission self-driving vehicles in a short time. So let me turn to the fourth pillar that I mentioned, which is short-lived climate pollutants. And this is a very hopeful piece of the story. Carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas by volume, lasts 100, 200, a very long time, a very long number of years, longer than our lifespan. So for every amount of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere, it will be there for our entire life. That is not the case with short-lived climate pollutants. So if we reduce emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, we actually take out of the atmosphere a certain amount of CO2 equivalent and give ourselves more time to deal with this set of problems. So the largest short-lived climate pollutants and most important are methane, black carbon, and F gases, such as hydrofluorocarbon. So California, over the last few decades, has reduced black carbon, which is primarily particulate matter from diesel and other exhaust, by 90% or more. So in the form of smog in the Los Angeles basin, for example, to give you a point of reference. And we are very interested in helping places like Beijing and Delhi do the same thing, but to do it much more quickly. Black carbon attaches to ice and snow and increases the melt of those areas and is significant, creates significant warming. So we know how to reduce black carbon. Part of it, as they say, is diesel particulate. There are also 1 billion people in the world who continue to cook, indoor cooking and heating with open flame. And that is a very significant source of black carbon. So we know how to address that as well, and we need to do it. California just released a draft plan that identifies the fact that although we've already reduced by 90%, by 2030 we will reduce the remaining amount of black carbon that California produces by 50% further. In addition, for methane, much of methane, although you might think it comes primarily from oil and gas, it's not insignificant amount from oil and gas, but 60% actually comes from agriculture. A significant amount of it is methane produced from dairy cattle, and so we need to expend a fair amount of time and energy working on dairy digesters. Also organic material, which is a huge opportunity because that's agricultural waste, which can be turned into fuel. And also gives us the ability, if we use it intelligently, to reduce the fire loads of our overgrown underbrush and forests. So these are really significant opportunities. Let me talk a little bit about F-gas, which is a refrigerant primarily. And air conditioners around the world use F-gases. There's an estimate that if we don't make a change to the use of hydrofluorocarbons in air conditioning, given the growth of air conditioning, particularly in China and India, that by the year 2050, 27% of greenhouse gases will be from air conditioners. So in a way, that's good news because we can make some changes. There are alternatives to HFCs. California and the United States and many countries around the world support having HFCs be covered by the Montreal Protocol and have them phased out. Right now, India is the primary roadblock to that, and they seem to be softening. So our hope is that they will stand aside and let this change be made. If they don't, I think there will be a significant effort by California, Europe, and others to promote a robust reduction in other ways. So that's an encouraging aspect. California is calling for a 40% reduction in methane methane releases from all sectors by 2030, and a 40% reduction in HFCs and other F-gases in the same time frame. So lots going on. The fifth area that I wanted to mention is natural and working lands. Right now, California has a very significant percentage of land that is either agriculture or open space in some form as forests or desert. And interestingly enough, these are sources of emissions overall. It's kind of surprising, but that is the case. A lot of that is obvious this year because of the number of forest fires that we have. But that's not the only reason. The soils in California are not sequestering carbon in the way that they probably could and should. And so there's a lot of work being done around things like compost and now biochar to add those as supplements to agricultural and pastoral lands. And there's a fair amount of research being done that indicates and concludes that adding those kinds of supplements can be a very significant source of sequestration to the tune of actually offsetting a very large percentage of California's emissions. If that's true, that's a potential game changer, but that's something that's in process right now. But land use is also extremely relevant to greenhouse gas emissions. I mentioned the vehicle miles traveled in California. A lot of those vehicle miles are based on how we make land use decisions. So people who commute from Modesto to the Bay Area for a job add a lot of of emissions, and in multiple ways. So one thing that California is doing and thinking about quite a lot is how do we develop in some different ways, including improving things like infill development that really actually turn out to be, the market has changed. So a lot more people want to live in cities. That is got its challenges, but it also has its benefits because cities tend to have higher densities and require less land to house people. We all know that that creates some problems as well. But the idea potentially is that we live in higher densities without, becoming rats in a cage, hopefully. But that it gives us the opportunity to make decisions to preserve things like prime farmland in the Central Valley, to preserve open space for recreation, for environment, and for the changing planet, the changing climate. So we're spending a fair amount of time thinking about how to make better land use decisions and to tie those decisions to improve transit. There are many things that we can do. I happen to be, among other things, the chair of something called the Strategic Growth Council. We have about $500 million this year in cap and trade money to promote projects that are connected to transit and transit-oriented development to promote the idea of infill. So those are the areas where California, we have a huge challenge, but I think also a huge set of opportunities, as I've mentioned, in these kind of major areas where we're pushing ahead, thinking about 2020 and beyond. But I also want to mention, in about 5 or 10 minutes before I open for questions, that California is doing a fair amount of work around international efforts, not just as an example domestically of what can be done with a large economy, but also what we can do in partnership with quite a few entities around the world. So California has entered into agreements with China. We are helping them with some of their cap and trade market efforts. We're working on black carbon, as I noted, other air pollution issues. We have some agreements with India, Peru, Mexico. It was not always the case that California had a State Department. Although I suppose the US might argue with me a little bit on that. But we are spending a significant amount of time and energy working with other countries. And some of this is around climate, and some of it is around pollution. For example, a not insignificant percentage of pollution in California comes from Asia. And that's a reality, so it is well worth our, from a self-interested point of view on many levels, to work with governments around the world to reduce pollution. So, but one of the things that I've been working on quite a lot is a slightly different effort, which we have dubbed the Under 2 MOU, which stands for keeping climate increases below 2 degrees Celsius, but also getting to under 2 tons per capita of emissions per year by 2050. Those are roughly equivalent efforts, the under 2 degrees and the under 2 tons per capita. And what California has done, originally in partnership with a state called Baden-Württemberg in Germany, is to create a subnational agreement. So we have these 194 countries that are working towards an agreement in Paris. It has been our observation, shared by a number of subnationals around the world, that the ambition of the international effort is insufficient to keep us below 2 degrees. And so we have devised an agreement, an MOU, that calls for any subnational that is so inclined to agree that they will reduce their own emissions in their jurisdiction by 80 to 95% by 2050, or to under 2 tons per capita. And the other piece of the agreement is that they will write their own appendix identifying in the 2030 timeframe what they'll do consistent with that 2050 goal. And so we have put together so far 42 jurisdictions, and we added a Chinese province today that represents together something like $14 trillion of GDP and 500 million residents that are calling for this more substantial set of ambitions. And it is an incredibly disparate group of subnationals. So we have maybe 10 entities that are in the rainforest around the world. We have 4 or 5 entities from throughout Africa, a number of European and North American states and provinces, all of which have a different approach to getting to this goal, and all of which have been willing to commit to it in writing in a particular way. So the state of Acre, Brazil is 87% rainforest and 13% deforested at this point. It represents 4% of the Amazon rainforest, which, by the way, is 1.7 billion tons of carbon captured in that piece of rainforest. So if you cut it down, you can do the math on what that would mean for emissions around the world. Well, their approach to 2030 and beyond is to dramatically reduce and reverse the deforestation in their state. Well, that's a very different set of actions than what we're taking here in California, but given the scale and scope of the carbon in that forest is at least as important, if not more so, than what we're doing in California. And so what we've done is to create a coalition of these entities, and now we're going to work together with an entity called We Mean Business that has corporations making similar commitments to reducing their greenhouse gas footprint. And we're going to take these groups to Paris. We hope to be close to 100 jurisdictions by the time we get to Paris and 100 businesses, and make our case, both for more action and also for an institutional role through the United Nations process. We've gotten very substantial support from the United Nations and actually from the United States and China and others around the world. So it's another aspect of how we're thinking about what California is doing, how we can have an effect, and how we can, even though we're 1% of emissions, to have an outsized voice in where we're going in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think I'll stop there and see if there are questions and comments. Thank you.
So as usual, we start with student questions. This is a class. Is that a student question? Yes.
Hi there. My name's Dave. I'm at the law school, but also from Canada. And I'm wondering, when you look at future jurisdictions in Canada and the US that may join the California-led cap-and-trade system, who are the more likely candidates? And I know you have a legal background, so in answering, if you can talk about the constitutional sidestep you're able to achieve as a state linking across borders.
Yeah, so California has right now one official link to its cap and trade market, and that is Quebec. And Ontario, Canada, just announced its intention to join as well. British Columbia has some interest, although they have a $60 carbon tax, at least related to the gas sector of the market. So those three provinces actually represent 70% of the population of Canada. So I would think they are, obviously two are already involved, British Columbia potentially. There are some interest in New Zealand, potentially if there's, depending on the new government in Australia, there had been some interest of the previous government. There's been something of a change in Australia. That market becomes relevant. Ultimately, if California is going to succeed from a market perspective, we need to link with other locations. There's a fair amount of interest around the world. One thing that we've been extremely careful about in California is to make sure that these markets are real, that their jurisdictions are serious about enforcement for violations, and we have a requirement that any market that we link with have equivalent requirements as to California. And that's not an easy thing to do because it's a pretty stringent set of requirements. Having said that, California's market has worked. It has both a minimum price and a maximum price. The auctions have all pretty much exceeded the minimum price, and the market seems to be working well. We would hope to start linking with Europe at some point. And the simple answer to the legal question is that these are voluntary agreements. We're not allowed to do treaties, so we don't.
Great. Student questions? Corinne?
So my question is on the first pillar that you've mentioned about the 50% reduction. Two questions, I'll keep them very short. One is, why did you constrain yourself with this definition of renewables rather than opening it up to like zero emission technologies, which would potentially include like natural gas plus CCS? And on the other side, are there any provisions in that first pillar about how to handle the recyclability of the material from storage if you're using batteries?
Yeah, okay. So the answer to your first question is that definitions in statutes are as much a political issue as a scientific one. And there are certainly many interests that would like various definitions of what constitutes renewable energy. And I suspect if we get to the point of having a real potential for zero emission sequestration, that some of that definition will change. But right now, the political coalition that's able to pass the legislation, it's a delicate balance.
Great. Another student question over here?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned trying to set some kind of a limit at 2 tons of carbon equivalent per capita. And I like to fly home to New York at least once a year to visit my family. And that contributes probably more than 2 tons.
No.
No, okay. So I was going to ask if the state has any plans or any way to incentivize airlines to pursue carbon reductions.
So it's less than you might think to fly as an individual if you do the calculation on it. But having said that, the state is very limited in terms of aviation. It's primarily preempted by the federal government. We can't set fuel standards, for example, for aviation fuel. But there are a couple of things that are happening. One is that there is a lot of work on biofuel for aviation. And second, there are some interesting reports about advances on electricity-driven engines for aviation.
I was wondering how your emissions goals for 2050 include indirect emissions. Say there's a great company in Silicon Valley inventing carbon-saving or emission-saving technology, which will actually be produced in China, I guess. So the emissions will take place there, but the consumers are here. Is that somehow being reflected in the balance of emissions and pollution?
Yeah, that's a good question, and
Can we repeat the questions?
yeah.
Can't hear you.
So there's technology, a Silicon Valley company that's generating technology that will reduce emissions, but the production will take place in China.
Of the equipment.
And therefore, how do you deal with that in terms of California's emissions? Well, ultimately, I mean, there are some complex answers to that question. But let me, on a simple level, we do not capture all life cycle emissions, but we capture some of them. We don't capture every piece of leakage, but we capture most of it. So to some extent, we will capture that reduction in China, and to some extent, we won't. We have to make this a more worldwide system to get it all.
Okay, now Bert, and then up in the back there.
Okay, there are a lot of California numbers that don't really make a lot of sense. And the one I was asking you about was the one on energy storage. That number is given in megawatts. That's power, that's not energy. If you want that, I can give it to you today. Up on the hill, it's a Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. It stores 10 times as much energy for 1/10,000th of a second. And it exceeds your megawatt standard by a huge amount. I have tried to talk to the Public Utilities Commission about this, and the only answer I get is everybody understands it. But megawatts are power, and energy storage is power times time, and we don't have a standard that makes any sense. If I was still running the accelerator center, I would try and lease myself to PG&E, and then they would make the requirement for a very cheap.
Well,
So
let me
megawatt hours.
let me acknowledge that they're in the world of power, energy, that there is a difference between megawatts and megawatt hours. I, however, am not so cynical to believe that even PG&E would try to get through its obligation by buying a second of time at the linear accelerator. Actually, it's not, but okay.
So it seems like a number of prominent people and organizations in the climate movement are saying that essentially the closest thing we have to a silver bullet in climate policy is a carbon tax. And I'm wondering if that's something that could be implemented at the state level and what the conversations are like in your office around
Sure.
that.
I actually think even if we use megawatt hours, I think storage is actually more close to the silver bullet than carbon tax. But moving that aside, the cap and trade covers 85% of the economy, and it is extremely similar to a carbon tax. It's about, right now it's a little over $12 a ton. And I think if you talk to economists who model what a cap and trade system looks like versus a tax, they model it very similarly. So I think there's an argument right now that California has a price on carbon equivalent to a carbon tax. Having said that, I know the governor, he wants to do what's effective. So far, the cap and trade system has been effective in terms of getting a market started in a coherent way. If there was a political way to get to a tax, if that was a solution that worked across the nation, I think we'd go there very, very quickly.
Great. David?
Last week when at Xerox Park in Palo Alto, Wade Crowfoot, I believe, is in your organization.
I hired him.
He mentioned that the PUC was looking at the values for distributed generation, so that it's properly valued compared to centralized generation.
Sure.
Things like transmission, distribution, distribution reduction. Could you speak to that and when that might be, Captain?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of these are big topics. There are benefits to the grid, some of which are around security, some of which are around reliability, and other benefits that result from distributed, whether it's generation or storage or the grid itself. And the PUC is going through a process to figure out how it might evaluate that and to incorporate that into when it looks at how it gives authority to utilities to make purchases of power. And when that's going to occur, God knows. Hopefully, it's in process. Yeah.
Okay, now we have more questions. I think we'll go with the last question.
Okay.
Looks like a student.
Now that transport fuels are covered under California's cap and trade, how do you think this will interact with the existing low carbon fuel standard?
Another easy question. The question was, cap and trade now covers transportation fuels, meaning gasoline. How will this interact with the low carbon fuel standard, which requires by 2030 a 10% reduction in the greenhouse emissions that come from fuel? So that remains to be seen to a certain extent. There are separate requirements. So part of it is to offset emissions per se in the cap and trade world. So as the LCFS, the low carbon fuel standard, reduces the emissions from fuel, that will actually reduce the cap and trade burden to some extent, but meanwhile the cap will be shrinking and the cost will go up. So in theory they should work together to really reduce the amount of emissions coming from fuel. And you would think that that would tend to lead to want to find zero emission fuels and zero emission ways to move.
Great. Before we thank Ken one last time, I will remind you we have the first energy social of the year right outside right after this, and you can actually ask Ken some more questions on a one-on-one basis. So thanks very much, Ken.
Thank you very much.